The next is effects processing. And I put this kind of before EQ. I may reverse these in terms of the course, but right now it's set up here. The reverb and reflections and delay effects have different effects in the stereo 3D sound field. And so if I call up, let's just look from the top perspective, because this is really the effect of reverberant energy. If we have, for example, reverbs, reverbs will add depth of space. Okay. Now, there's one thing about reverb. Reverb is basically broken down into or basically all sound. Let's just start from there. Reverb and sound is basically broken down into three basic things. You have the direct sound, right, which is the dry, unprocessed sound. So somebody talks to you from across the room, you hear the direct signal, right, without any effect on it. Then you get an area that has what are known as early reflections, right? And early reflections are the first reflections that bounce off of surfaces, right? So the early reflections, for example, if you had a space and you had a sound here, right, the sound source here, which is radiating out in all directions, and you're listening over here, right? So those are your ears, right? Got your hair kind of flying back or whatever. And so the first wave that hits you is the sound wave from the sound source. That's the direct sound. The next element is the sound that bounces off the side walls, off the floor, and hits you, off the back wall and hits you. The sound also goes to the rear wall. It goes off the ceiling. And those arrive later, right? So there's a certain area, about 20 milliseconds or so, right, where those reflections actually merge with the original sound. So the direct sound ends up getting mixed with the early reflections. So you don't hear the early reflections as reverb or delays. They actually merge with the original because your brain can't separate things that are shorter than 20 milliseconds in general. It merges them together, it blends them together, and that creates a tonal coloration to the original sound. And that actually can be coloration, that creates a tonal coloration to the original sound, and you can use this to your advantage, right? And it can also work against you, okay? Because these early reflections are actually what defines the size of a space. Very important, right? So if you want something to sound big, you want to expand those early reflections longer, right? When delays occur beyond 20 milliseconds, they become echoes, okay? And so that's the expansion of early reflections. So if you're 50 feet away from a surface and you say something, it bounces off that surface and hits you about 100 milliseconds later, you hear that as a delay, as a slapback, and that has a different type of effect, which can add depth. And then you have reverb. So what happens is that the reflections or the sound doesn't stop when it hits you. It keeps going and it keeps bouncing off the wall very fast, right, at 1130 feet per second. So sound, imagine like a room full of super balls, right, all bouncing around the room at ridiculous at 1130 feet per second. You're just getting pummeled by all these different delays, right, these little balls that are hitting you. That's reverb, right? It's so when these reflections become so densely packed and they get beyond 20 milliseconds, they become a separate entity that you hear independent, and that's reverb. So the effect of all this is that the direct sound is just the direct sound. The early reflections determine the size of the space that it's in, and the reverb determines how reflective the space is and how that colors the sound. Okay, so longer reverb times does not make a bigger space. The reverb time is determined by the tempo of the song, right? That determines how long you can make the reverb so it doesn't make things really muddy, right? The faster the tempo, the shorter the reverb time. You just have to do it, except for maybe special effects. You have a fast sound with a big gong that hits and you want the reverb to go on for 10 seconds, that's fine. If you put a 10-second reverb on a snare drum, it's going to be a big bloody mess, right? So the faster the tempo, the shorter the reverb time. That's the general rule. So what happens is that in this perspective, right, when we have a sound, right, from the top side view here, if there's a delay from the dry sound to the reverb, which is called a pre-delay, right? So in other words, if you actually take the sound, You have the dry sound here. If there's a delay, right, before the reverb starts, which there always is, technically, then what happens is the original sound sounds focused and up front, and the reverb adds depth to the sound, right? It adds space behind. The early reflections determine how big the space is. So if you set the early reflections the right size, you can actually make the voice sound like it's in the same room with you, right? And that's very effective in headphones, right? So you can make it sound like if you close your eyes, it's like, oh my God, this is somebody talking to me in this space, right? That's kind of an effect you want to go for, right? Because that helps to bring the music out of the speakers and into the field with you. Really so powerful, right? I just can't talk enough, and you'll hear me talk blab on endlessly about how important that is. If there's no pre-delay, no delay between the reverb and the voice, and you set the level of the reverberant energy equal to or higher than the voice, then the signal, right, the voice goes back into the speakers. And now it sounds like it's coming from a distance. So you have 10% dry signal and 90% reverb and early reflections. And the early reflections would be arriving at about the same time, right, as the dry signal. And the reverb would be arriving at the same time and tail on. Then the voice will sound off in a distance. Okay, so you can take any instrument and make it sound like it's coming from 10 feet behind the speakers, or you can, by putting pre-delay, make it sound like really dry and focused and up front, and then the reverb going way off into the distance, right? So that's a very powerful tool that sets the size of what you're working with, right? So that is, just such a powerful tool, early reflections. When we get into the other effects, like slapback effects, create a space. So if you have a slap, you have a vocal here, and then you have a delay, how long that delay takes, the longer it takes, the more distance, the more space you're going to have. So think of yourself like in an alleyway, right? If you close your eyes, you clap your hands, and you hear a delay, you can have an idea in your head about how far away that building is from you, right? And that sense is carried over. So having a slap, what makes it really powerful is it adds depth to a mix, right? And it's also very small because it's a singular delay. Reverb is very dense. You have to be very careful about it because it takes up a lot of visual space, reverb, right? So how you shape it is really critically important. And the different types of reverb. Some will add, like halls will add warming characteristic. Plates will add presence to a voice, right, to a sound. Room sounds will add more immediacy, right? That's a great way of moving an instrument, like percussion instruments, behind the other instrumentation, right, is by using rooms. Chambers, all these different types of effects have different sonic characteristics in terms of the way that they affect signals, and we'll get into that. The other element that use in terms of like phasers, flangers, and chorusing effects. And those have a sort of spreading energy, right? So they'll take an instrument and they'll thin out the density of it. It'll spread the energy around. So if you use a chorus or phasing effect and you do it in stereo, you can actually expand signals outside of the speakers. You're playing with the phase, so the center image signal, or the same amount of energy, instead of existing in a small area here, is now spread out over a wider area. And it will become thinner and more transparent as a result. Sometimes this is an effective thing, like flangers and phaser effects are really cool for, like, guitars and instrumentation that makes them more focused and dynamic, right? So it adds like a real, like, unique focused characteristic. Like it's like a shifting filter, which is exactly what it is. It's a shifting filter, like an equalization circuit, right? And that's kind of cool for focusing instruments, right? Chorusing is really used more for spreading instrumentation. We'll talk about the different forms of phasing. So we'll talk about delay and time-based effects and how all those things affect the way that your signal is perceived in the 3D sound field, because all these things will add depth and width, right, to the signal. So all top stuff, right? And so most of what we talked about is not so much the up-down stuff. It's the front-back type of stuff, right? Compression affecting the front-back, levels affecting the front-back, panning going left and right, right? So this is from this top 2D perspective. We're going left, right, front, back, okay? And then from the front perspective, we'll go up, down, and I'm going to talk about that in the equalization section next, right? So those time-based effects, those delay-based effects are all about affecting depth and size perception in a mix, okay? So, and that's really the next phase here, right? So, oh, and I'm sorry, actually, just kind of looking here. Okay, I'm sorry, we kind of lost a connection here with the chat here, so I'm just kind of gonna do a scroll back to make sure I didn't miss anything. Looks like Johnny's kind of carrying most of the load here. Okay, so that's our thing with you know the way that you use these different types of effects, right? And some unique kind of effects processing. They all are typically used in conjunction with other things like EQs and filters and compression that you can use in conjunction with these different effects to help focus them and give them a particular placement. The timing and the musicality of the effects processing is critical to making it work. So it's not just about putting a hall reverb. The hall reverb has a certain shape that may not have the best characteristic for your vocal given the type of music that you're using. So you want to have an effect that has the right shape to it so that when you put it in perspective of the mix, it sounds natural, right? And that's what we're really going to dig into that and how you can really open up the size of a mix. All right, so let's move on.